as much as people kind of wear failure as a badge, often nobody likes to be friends with a failure. I've noticed, at least for myself. Maybe I don't know if you've ever failed, but it's definitely an unpleasant. I don't know if that's what you're referring to.
I think friends are overrated.
Hmm?
Friends are overrated.
All right, are you rolling? Okay, by the way, what's the best way to pronounce your last name? Because I've pronounced it 17 different ways this past week.
We say Polinick.
Polnick?
Polinick.
So Chuck Palahniuk, author of Fight Club, 10, 11, 12 other novels, essays, love Stranger Than Fiction, by the way, your book of essays, author of a lot of short stories. I'm pretty sure I've read all of them. Fight Club, of course, became movie. Fight Club 2, which I have in one of these rooms, is a graphic novel. And I read, and I didn't know how actively involved you were in that, but I read in this book, your new book, Consider This moments in my writing life after which everything was different. The best book on writing I have ever read, and I've read a ton of them. And this is so detailed, plus interwoven with your stories, beginning writing, and with each novel and short stories and everything. And there's so many interesting things that I learned from. I think this podcast might have more pauses because I'm going to just keep going to pages I folded over and try to remember why I folded them over and then ask you about them. But you just said something that I think about a lot, which is that friends are overrated. And I wonder about this. Like, how many friends do you think someone should have?
Mm, 4.
4?
4.
What if they move?
Uh, friends aren't based on proximity. Friends are based on a mutual shared concern for one another or a shared passion.
Reminds me of an essay Raymond Carver once wrote where it's basically and it starts off with a photo of so Raymond Carver is a short story writer. You refer to him constantly in the book. Raymond Carver is has a photo of him, Tobias Wolff, and one other I think Mississippi-based writer. I forget now.
Barry Hannah?
No, I don't know, it was him, Tobias Wolff, and he was, like, nervous about becoming and they all kind of expressed nervousness in this essay about being friends with each other
Mm.
because of what you just said. They were afraid that then it would be a commitment of time, and how are they gonna see each other, if ever again, and, there wasn't the internet then for email, and phone calls were expensive, and so I've even asked my therapist this, like, what's the right amount of friends to have? Because there's also all this research, which I don't know whether to pay attention to or not, but it says you're healthier, you live longer, or you're happier when you have friends. And so I'm always curious, like, because I feel I work too much, well, how much time should I devote to making a friend?
And there's a big chasm between friends and acquaintances, friends and deep acquaintances, and they shouldn't be confused. You can have a lot of acquaintances, a lot of connection, a lot of network, but I don't think that translates necessarily to a lot of friends.
Yeah, and like, I noticed too, and we're gonna get to your book, but this fascinates me. I always see people vacationing with coworkers or with business partners, and that strikes me as profoundly stupid because you see them all the time anyway. Like, what else do you want to do with them? Like, you're gonna go to the beach and be kind of naked and hang out with them all the time, and then go. Is that gonna improve your business deals with them or maybe think you're friends with them? You're not really friends with them. So I don't know, this seems to be a common theme in our culture as well.
Well, think about Starbucks because its business model was to be the third place, and the third place used to be church, used to be religion. And so you have family, you had the workplace, and you had your community of faith. And people really don't have that. And so sometimes the third place is the gym, and sometimes the third place is your passion. It's for me, it's the writer's workshop,
Yeah.
who are friends that I've had since 1990. And we meet typically once a week. And we are what I would call friends because our shared passion and our shared investment in each other keeps us together for decades. Um, so a lot of people don't have that third place, or Starbucks has tried to position itself as the third place, and it doesn't really work that way.
No, because I think what happened is Starbucks did become a third place, but a third place for you to just sit and dive into your computer and tune out everyone else,
right,
and there's no coworkers or family
or
or
community,
friends
right.
to bother you.
It's not based on because the third place is kind of it has to be based on the intangible passion, whether it's religion or whether it's kind of physical fitness, which is a kind of asceticism, or whether it is a writing passion or an art passion. You know, the third place, whether it's a class, it's based on something that's not work and it is not home, it's not family. So I'm starting to sound like Lewis Hyde.
Well, no, but it's this is actually it occurred to me this does segue into consider this, but I'm gonna explore it a little further, which is that, I think I think you're right, that there's a third place that maybe is kind of this shared interests, and you're lucky that you've had one with a bunch of people since 1990, and then I'm wondering, you said it doesn't have to be physically present, but I wonder how important that actually is, like, you're physically present with your workshop friends.
No, think about it. It used to be that people would go to their religious community once a week. And in doing so, they would make a confession of sorts. They would reveal their worst selves. They would present everything that they had done wrong during the week, and they would be given community back and forgiven for their transgressions. So once a week, you got a clean slate. And then more and more religious communities became kind of a theater for looking good, for just kind of presenting status, presenting your best, cleanest, nicely dressed self. And they weren't that place about being grotty. So more and more, the third place, you know what it is? You know what it is. Hi, I'm Chuck,
Ah,
and I'm an alcoholic. It's that 12
right.
step place where people go and they present their absolute worst selves. I did this week. I did this week. And regardless of what Thomas Wolfe says, that is the place where they have to take you back. Family
Yeah.
doesn't take you back anymore. But those 12-step basement grotty places, like the support groups in Fight Club, they have to take you back, and there's something glorious about that.
Well, you just segued before I had the chance to, but and consider this, you write about this in 2 different places, in the book, and again, this book I feel is a combination of not only your story interweaving through, but you start off with more of kind of the details of language and how language can be thought of and played with in any writing, but really, really any writing, but you're talking primarily about fiction, but it could be any writing. And later on, I feel you talk more about the essences of plot and how you drive the reader forward. And so this occurs in both sections, but the notion, and I think you do this very well in your writing, and you bring up Fight Club as an example, the notion of building a community in a work of fiction as well as rules for that community. And we have kind
Right.
of this primal way in which we want those rules in that community and a special community defined by special rules. So Fight Club, the first rule of, I'm not even going to repeat because it's a cliche to repeat it, but the rules. And you do that throughout your novels, is that you define almost the rules of the main character, and then people either join or not, or are repulsed in many cases by these rules, and that form the linkage and even the intimacy between the characters and others. And I found that to be, I've never thought of that out loud when I've read books or written books, but that is really strong.
That is entirely Victor Turner, the British cultural anthropologist who identified what he called liminal and limnoid events.
Oh my god, hold on a second. I gotta just take notes. Fuck the podcast. I'm just taking notes. Well,
So, liminal events are typically things that take place in the transitions between things. Halloween is a liminal event. It takes place between summer and winter. The honeymoon is a liminal event. It takes place between being single and being married. You must leave your community typically for 3 days, and after 3 days, culturally, you come back.
and throughout all religions, there are these moments, like in
3
Orthodox
days.
Judaism or
Yeah.
Hasidic Judaism, a woman menstruating, there's a before and after, and how the husband treats her. I'm not Orthodox or anything like that. I just know.
But, I think it's terrific when you look at these and the rituals for liminal things. But Victor Turner also identified what he called limnoid things, limnoid events, which have the nature of liminal events, which are characterized by uh, communitas, which is kind of a leveling of the social hierarchy. Everyone is equal. And it's also limnoid and liminal events are also characterized by a inversion of the power hierarchy. On Halloween, little children who have no power get to dress up as outsider beings. They dress up as the dead, they dress up as the wrong gender, they dress up as animals, and they go out and they demand tribute from adults who are the people who typically have power.
Mm.
Christmas caroling used to be about poor people going to your house and singing songs, and if you did not give them food or gold, they would break your windows. Christmas caroling used to be a frightening thing. Anyway, communitas, reversal of the power hierarchy, and there's something else. Anyway, limnoid events have those characteristics, but they're not typically held at the juncture between things. A limnoid event is Burning Man, where people just decide we're going to throw a big party, which has the characteristics of communitas, where everyone is equal.
So that's fascinating. So again, taking your most famous book, Fight
Fight Club.
Club, that's obviously you're creating this internal made up hierarchy which reverses the power structure. That's a lot of the themes of the book. But if you think about it, primate or humans are different from other primates in that, let's say with a chimpanzee tribe, the only source of happiness really is whether you move up or down that one hierarchy. You can't escape the 30 people, the 30 other chimpanzees in your tribe. You either get cortisol when you move down, which makes you unhappy, or you get, I don't know, oxytocin when you move up the hierarchy, it makes you happy. And you can't get away from it. But with humans, I feel, and I've thought about this a lot, you can diversify hierarchies. So let's say you have a bad day at business, which is very hierarchical from the assistant to the assistant to the assistant, all the way up to the VP and the president and the CEO. That's very hierarchical. Let's say you have a bad day at business. Well, you can go off to the golf course where there's another hierarchy, and maybe you
Mhm.
could have a good game of golf and find happiness again. So you could diversify the hierarchies you join. And what you're saying with fiction, it's you can kind of escape into this other world where a hierarchy is also being defined that you could kind of relate to or join.
Well, and according to Turner, with limnoid events, you're basically kind of experimenting with a social model, allowing people to participate in the social model for a very brief period, completely voluntarily. And then you see whether or not people adopt it and perpetuate it. The Santa Rampage, where hundreds of people would get together all dressed as Santa, all using the name Santa, and they would kind of rampage and party through an urban area. That has since been completely taken on by the culture. Now there are thousands of Santa Rampages. Um, Things that used to be very edgy that the Cacophony Society was doing, like Burning Man, have been co-opted by Nike. And
Mm.
that's exactly what should happen. That is what Victor Turner says happens to a successful limnoid event.
Well, take like Star Wars. Okay, the Jediism is a religion, an official religion in the UK, and many people all over the world would actually subscribe to it because
Yeah.
they escaped into it. It felt like you said, it's a safe way to test whether some fictional group feels good inside. It felt good enough to enough people that people regularly say, "Oh, I'm gonna use the force here," and or whatever.
If
And
it serves people, people will perpetuate it. And that's what you're hoping for.
and it's interesting that you include this essentially in a writing advice book. I've never seen it. This it's one of the reasons why I like this book so much. Is that there's so many things that I never really put words to, but you include this advice in a book about writing, and I think it is very important. Like, you think I mean, you think of like The Sopranos as an example on TV, is this weird New Jersey mafia subculture that we're allowed to safely play, "Oh, I'm gonna be a mafia guy while I watch." You very in this book too, throughout this book, you kind of connect biology with words. So, instead, like, just to quickly make reference to another section, instead of using to be verbs, use action verbs
Right.
because it'll fire the part of the brain as if the brain is actually doing that action.
Mhm.
And so similarly here, if there's a limnoid that or some group plus rules that I'm reading about, maybe for that moment, I'm actually feeling like I'm a member of it, and it's a way to safely see if do I like being a member of this or do I not wanna be a member of this? And that drawing the reader in like that almost biologically and neurologically, I guess, does lead to strong writing.
Well, and also that's one great argument for the workshop is that in workshop you get to tell the story out loud and then see whether people instantly engage with it. Because it's not the stories that you tell that shut everyone down in complete awe. Everyone is so overwhelmed by the end of the story that it's silence. It's the stories that you tell where everyone can relate. Recently in the workshops that I lead with students, we were talking about used magazine stores and how they refuse to buy people's collections of National Geographic or Playboy because no one ever throws them away. So there is no market for them. And someone else in the group said, I wonder if that is how the big box of porn in the woods happens. And everyone in that group, 25 people, ages 19 to 60, instantly had this shocked look because they had all, as children, found the big box of porn in the woods. And they all thought it was just them. And they had never talked about finding the big box of porn in the woods. And suddenly, someone had said the thing no one had ever acknowledged. And they were all desperate to tell their story. And the room was filled with 100 different versions of the big box of porn in the woods. It was kind of glorious. And that's what you look for in a story. And that's how Workshop kind of allows you to test material to see if people really engage with it in that completely visceral way.
Yeah, I wonder if I wonder how you think, fiction is affected by the fact that there's now so much exposed reality on, let's say, social media. So, for instance, any group you could think of, probably even including that one, there's some Facebook group or some group on some social media site that is that's the equivalent of a limnoid. So you don't have to you no longer have to actually read it in fiction. You could kind of experience many of these things in the real world because now there's so many reality stories out there. I wonder if that affects people's interest in fiction.
I think people still have to be in the presence of other people for that important thing to happen. The whole paradigm in religion that it takes 2 or more people to be present for God to be present. That there has to be this kind of limbic chemistry happening. People have to be present. And it's something I write about in the next book, the horror novel, in that now that people have become audiences have become so automatized with everyone consuming media at home, they're watching movies and they're thinking, why aren't movies as funny or as scary as they used to be? And it's because we're watching them alone. We're not watching them in this kind of
Hmm.
soup of other people's limbic emotions.
You don't think it's because there might be some chance that we see almost anything we see now in a horror movie. Now, of course, there's no monsters in real life, but those are just, metaphors for the monsters in real life, but and which we do now see more than ever on social media. You could YouTube almost anything and see it instead of seeing a horror movie. And I wonder if that takes the energy out of a horror movie a little bit.
I think that the larger factor, there's always the failure to reinvent whatever the unspoken horror is at the moment. But I think the larger factor is the fact that we're consuming these things alone, and that studies show that our body chemistry is different when we're being frightened with other people, and when studios are going to screen a new movie, they will run a contest so that they fill the theater with 19-year-olds who've all won tickets over the internet or the radio, and the 6 critics who are sitting in there will react more positively because they're surrounded by 800 kids who are euphoric about having won tickets for this thing. So they're going to laugh at everything or they're going to scream at everything. And that's going to affect how the critics review the movie.
So when you're writing fiction though, and someone's reading it, they're consuming your fiction by themselves. So you're giving them this, you know, artificial, not artificial, but you're giving them this group with rules, classic example, Fight Club, and uh they're experiencing them that as an individual. What's happening there biologically? They're by themselves.
Mhm.
They're not with two people reading your book. What's happening there?
Because they are alone, uh, you have complete freedom to show them anything. Movies have to make things literal enough to film them, but that means they're also a very passive, easy thing to consume. But that means movies are incredibly limited in where they can go because that movie could be shown accidentally to a child, or that movie has to be shown to an enormous audience to make its profit. But a book has such low production costs and it's consumed by one person who makes all the effort to consume it. So a book can do anything. And so book it should, I think, because of its nature of consumption, it should be able to go to very extreme places. And it should depict people together because it's being consumed by someone alone. And I lost the third thing already. There you are. Oh,
So, and it's funny because now that I think about it, there's so many books with this idea. Like, just take Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club,
mhm.
or
Divine Secrets of the Ya Sisterhood, or How to Make an American Quilt, or Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. There are so many narratives about how women can come together and the rules in which they conduct themselves together so that they can share their lives and they can really counsel each other about their experience.
even a book like Old Man and the Sea. You get this sense that the old man has this code that he's living by, that maybe has lasted for thousands of years among fishermen, and we all sort of feel like we want to live by this code as well. Like, this is like a right way to live, and that feels a similar way.
And I can't speak. I don't typically read books that have a sort of single, alone, solitary narrative character. Um, I'm thinking of books like Generation X by Doug Copeland,
Yeah.
which is
Oh,
a
which
group
was
of
great.
friends. Yeah,
It defined the whole generation,
right.
and B, we all read it in 1992 or 93, and we were like, "That's me," and we all talked to our friends about it. It did define the generation.
And it's so funny how right now the millennials or Generation Y or Generation Z, they are dealing with exactly the same things that were dealt with in Generation X. The student loan, the inability to buy property, diminishing wages, everything that Doug complained about in that book is exactly what people are complaining about now,
And even the feeling in someone saying to you, "You're not gonna do as well in life as your parents,"
right?
because that was the big theme in the book Generation X, that your parents lived a good life. It's not going to happen to you. And the exact same thing are being felt by our kids today, the Gen Zs today.
One of the he coined so many terms, and one of them was the Jack and Jill party. Do you remember that term?
I don't remember.
It referred to the fact that you had to invite both your male friends and your female friends to a wedding shower in order to get the quality Eisenhower era gifts that you would have gotten in a previous generation. To get consumer goods of greater value, you had to invite both genders. So wedding showers became Jack and Jill parties. So it was all about sort of trying to keep up with your parents' standard of living.
Again, this reminds me of also Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, where he creates a set of words even to describe I don't know how to say Bakuman's religion,
Mm.
of how people are really relating. And so suddenly you want to start, your mind starts thinking, you want to start using those words, and you start noticing the same things in your own life. So it's interesting. I'm gonna get to some of the things you say about text, and the use of words, but and then we'll get into kind of more of these issues of plot and devices. But you have this one chapter I thought fascinating called textures, and you basically say things are descriptions, instructions, or exclamations, and it's good to kind of mix these. And I never even thought of it that way. I do think over my own 30 years of nonfiction writing that I've used a lot of this device instinctively, but actually putting it to words, it makes a huge sense, and I never thought of it this way. But if everything is just description, it's boring. Nothing could be just exclamation, and if it's just instruction, doesn't make any sense either. The kind of mixture of the three sort of helps a narrator create a story, create a plot.
Think of it like camera shots. You've got the distant shot coverage, you've got the medium shot, you've got the close up. And so you're kind of juggling your depth of perception by, the way in which you tell it, whether it's description or imperative or onomatopoeia.
Yeah, and it remind then there's another thing that you say later on too, which is mix first, second, and third person, which I never thought of. And remember, I have this book somewhere called Points of View, and it's short stories where each short story, though, okay, this short story is in the second person, this short story is in the first person, this is third person omniscient, and second person is always an interesting way to describe the difference between persons because it's an unusual one. It's using the you,
Mhm.
but Bright Lights Big City did it.
Right.
Mark Richard did it in his kind of memoir-esque book. But it's interesting. I never thought about combining all three.
And it's how people tell the best stories. When you listen to really good out loud storytellers, they, they will, sort of vary their pace, vary their sort of closeness to the subject by changing the point of view.
Yeah, because you can imagine like a story like, let's say I'm telling you a story and I'm saying, imagine you just walk into a bank and there's the bank robber. I didn't know what to do, but everybody, the whole bank was just on the ground. And then I just used second, first, and third. And it brings you in right away.
Yeah.
And then it's my experience. So you want to find out what happened to me next. And then then you're seeing what everybody's doing in the bank, maybe even me.
Well, and I think more importantly than, investment in the eye establishes the context for the story, who's telling it, so that it's not a made up story because someone's actually taking responsibility for having been there and witnessed it, and someone is being accountable for the telling of the story. It's not just a, third person omniscient sort of distant story.
Yeah. So, another thing you say about the eye, you say submerge the eye. So, and this one's interesting because I think this one's a subtle thing. If someone's telling a story in the first person, they think they're telling a story about themselves, but there's a danger to go overboard and maybe even have a little ego in it, which people can sense when they're reading. And I think so. Maybe you want to describe submerging the eye, but my impression is you and you use a great example is The Great Gatsby. It's not it's sort of about Gatsby, and you get Nick almost seems like a bland sort of person because he's submerging the eye. I can think of examples though where somebody is very much an I in a book, but it works really well when you're either self-deprecating or vulnerable in some way, or you give some other person status over you in the story.
And that's what works so nice about apostolic fiction. It's
What do you call it?
apostolic fiction. It's kind of an apostle talking about a greater character. This is my hero. It makes us like the narrator because the narrator is liking someone. We like
Hmm.
people who like people. Uh, that's an admirable thing.
Yeah, I guess, like, think about, like, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha as a classic example where it's not about or it's not from the point of view of Siddhartha, it's just his friend who looks up to him. So, it's interesting. But yeah, I like this idea of mixing the textures, mixing the persons, sort of changing what I think are the normal rules of how people think about writing.
And that's another kind of wonderful trick is if you can write in a third person, but make it incredibly voicey third person. So there's always this inference that a real person is telling the story. It's not the voice of God. It's not some stream of consciousness, perfect language person that you make the same mistakes consistently and you give the third person a voiciness. And that's a fascinating, wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, like, so a movie example is The Road Warrior. It's, like, from the point of view of this little boy looking up to max, and you only at the end realize, oh, that was that character, even though the whole thing was in the third person.
Kinda like Shane, yeah.
It's, it's interesting. All right, I'm gonna just keep going to the places where I've folds, and then I got to figure out why I folded it. Oh yeah, I was curious about this how to pass time because it seems like sometimes all great authors sometimes speed up the pace of a story and sometimes very deliberately slow it down in various ways. Like maybe they stop for a second to describe the geography. And of course, the geography will, in some way, if they're subtle enough, be a metaphor for what's happening in the story. But no matter what, it does slow the pacing of then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And by the way, a fog came over the mountains. And then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So it's interesting. Like maybe how do you know how to pace the time?
And part of it comes from, testing the story, reading it out loud, and seeing where it wears people out, where people need a rest, uh, and when you tell it out loud, you can put those pauses in it, so people are hanging on that silence. Do you remember Paul Harvey?
Yeah,
Do you remember Dr. Laura Schlesinger?
yeah.
They both had the same way of talk and break at weird moments. And that strange breaking quality that they had of pausing in the wrong places made you listen more closely. They both did it exactly the same. And so telling a story out loud, you can do that. But on the page, you have to use other devices for pacing the delivery. That's why I'm a complete fanatic about attribution in dialogue. Because if you don't put attribution or gesture into the dialogue and pace it the way an actor would pace it, then your reader is just going to plow through that dialogue and it won't matter how beautifully crafted you did it. It's going to be kind of wasted.
Did you ever read Journey to the End of the Night by Celine?
No.
Um, see, he's kind of crazy because of World War One, so he doesn't really attribute things, but you have a sense that he's doing a lot of the speaking because he's just rambling a lot. But he has a lot of repetition, and I think in your books, for instance, you often have a lot of repetition in sentences to kind of create that extra pacing, and you talk about the repetition a little bit here, but when you're thinking of doing, what's an example, for instance, that you would do it?
Repetition?
Yeah,
Repetition, I would use that, you know, um,
like in
so often. Think about the movie The Ring. Do you know The Ring?
mm-mm.
Citizen Kane. You
Okay,
don't know The Ring with Naomi Watts?
I don't.
About the video you watch that
I'm
kills
putting it on my
you?
list right now.
Okay, Citizen Kane. You know Citizen Kane.
Yes.
Okay, Citizen Kane, you see the entire horizontal of the plot right at the very beginning. Charles
Yeah.
Foster Kane is dead. You see the whole newsreel of his life. So you know every plot point that we're going to come across. And so as we reach each plot point, your brain is getting a little pop of serotonin. Like, oh, yeah, I know that. That was in the newsreel. And The Ring, the Naomi Watts horror movie, is basically about this kind of artsy video you watch, and 7 days later, you die. And so the discovery process is in discovering the source of each image and the meaning of each image in that short artsy video. So you see the video at the beginning of the movie, and then throughout the discovery process, you get that wonderful pop of brain chemistry every time the image is explained. Um, and so those work great. What I think of as thumbnail narratives, where you get the whole thing in a thumbnail at the beginning, so you know the entire horizontal of the plot, and then you see the whole plot unpacked. Titanic, the James Cameron movie, was the same thing. We had to see that computer model at the very beginning to see that computer Titanic, go along and hit the iceberg and start to sink, and we get the narrative of the sort of geeky guy saying it starts to sink at the bow, and then it goes up on end, and then it breaks in half, and then it goes to the bottom. So we've got the whole horizontal. We know what's going to happen. And so we can pay attention to the emotional vertical of the story as we see it actually dramatized. And so at the moment that the ship goes up on end and breaks in half, we're not thinking, whoa, wait, what? The ship broke in half? What the hell is that all about? We've already been told that's going to happen. We've already been told that that Citizen Kane is going to build Xanadu. None of these things are surprises. But what I like to do is keep the past constantly present in the narrative. And by establishing a chorus or a reference back to previous events that can be reiterated later in the story, you are keeping a more sort of cumulative idea of the narrative. And past plot points always are present because they're always kind of reiterated in a very repetitious chorus of some sort, um, so that the story doesn't occur as something linear in which things are constantly consumed and discarded. The story is more of an accumulation that you carry with you over the whole course of the book. Um, it's exactly kind of the opposite of the thumbnail narrative where we learn everything up front and then discover its meaning.
Yeah, so what do you think about that? So you're saying you don't like to be, here's the whole story, you know, how do you view the beginning of a story?
You know, you can do that in a book. My best teacher, Tom Spanbauer, did that really beautifully in the opening chapter of The Man Who Fell in Love with the Moon. It's all a kind of synopsis of the entire plot you're about to get. And in my book, Rant, I basically do that. The entire opening scene is a guy sitting in an airplane seat, and he tells a synopsis of the entire story that you're about to read. Um, it's hard to do because it has to be kept really short and concise, and it has to be memorable at the same time.
And it can't provide too many details or it's the book.
Well, exactly. It can't be, and that's why it's got to be kept short. And
And you have to keep the vertical out of it. So just to define what you mean by vertical, it's sort of the emotional ups and downs of the characters becomes the real story. So in Titanic,
right,
you know the Titanic's going down and most people are dying. You don't know anything about the love story that's about to occur.
right, exactly. The vertical is the psychological and emotional accumulation of weight throughout the story.
And you would think counterintuitively that that ruins the story, but it doesn't. Like Citizen Kane and Titanic are great examples where you don't need to know, you don't need to have cliffhangers on the horizontal, but the vertical is like, how did the two lovers meet on the Titanic? How did they fall in love? How did they overcome? Citizen Kane, how did he, have his dreams and create this empire, and then it gets to him and possibly kills him, and so on.
And then The Ring. You see those art film images so many times, but you never get bored of them because they have no meaning, they have no explanation, and you're just craving a definition. What do they mean? What is this inferring? What is this referring
So,
to?
so describe again your alternative to that. I'm trying to understand because this is like a big debate, right? In writing, is how much you give up in that first paragraph.
And it really just depends on how you choose to tell the story, whether you wanted to use flashbacks or flash forwards. Did you ever see They Shoot Horses, Don't They?
No.
Oh my
Oh
gosh,
my
I don't feel
God,
so bad
more
about not
notes.
having read Celine.
Don't worry about it. We're gonna exchange a lot of stuff that we have read.
Um, I am a public confession. I am a complete sucker for 1970s romantic fatalism because when
The
I was
Conversation, which
when
is kind of that, or the
I don't even know that.
well, it's Richard. Well, who was the Conversation was yeah, Coppola and what's the Gene? No, who's the main guy? Such a beautiful movie. It was like in between Godfathers. Hmm? Gene Hackman. Yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
Um, in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Which is basically a really claustrophobic movie that takes place during a Depression era marathon dance contest. Jane Fonda, David Sarrazin. And there are these strange little moments throughout the movie that are basically between major sort of acts of the story where we see the male protagonist in these kind of Kafkaesque, very artsy situations, completely unexplained. And they're basically flash forwards to things that take place after the end of the movie.
Mm.
So we're seeing the movie that takes place after the movie during the movie. So flash forwards work beautiful in that case.
Yeah, and that's like that Arrival, which was both a short story by an Asian science fiction writer, the Ken Xiu, Xiu, but also became a movie. where these aliens land and this woman has to communicate with them, and they're communicating by time is sort of one dimensional to
Mm,
them. So they're communicating by different moments in time in her life.
mm.
And so she sees these images and you never have a sense what's past, what's future until it all sort of wraps up, which is an interesting structure.
And Slaughterhouse-Five does that beautiful too.
Yeah,
It
Slaughterhouse Five
jumps
and
around
explicitly does it. They say right at the
temporally.
top they're
Y
gonna do it.
You're everywhere in
Yeah.
that. It's and the original short story Fight Club, that's why I used the rules, because I just wanted sort of touchstones that people would transition through that, they wouldn't necessarily even read the rule the second or the third time they saw it, but it would temporally it would signal to them that we were jumping temporally in time and place.
But
We were
I feel you also use repetition though let's say a main character is thinking, you might repeat something just because the character is thinking harder about it. I
Mhm,
feel like you use repetition as a temporal spacing device too. You're slowing down over some concept that
right.
the main character and hence the reader should think about a little more.
Because after the first time they read it, they're not really sub-vocalizing subsequent times they read it, and so it acts as a pause the way an actor would put a pause in dialogue. So you're controlling the delivery of the story by repeating things in that way. You know, in Invisible Monsters, my 3rd book, I use that phrase, "Sorry, mom, sorry, God," as that kind of sorbet that so many cultures have this sorbet that they say at the moment when nobody knows what to say, and the silence has to be bridged, and, in Catholicism, we always said it must be 7 minutes after the hour because supposedly Christ died at 7 minutes after the hour, and I know I have Jewish friends who say a Jewish baby has just been born because that's how you bridge that silence and allow
Mm,
for a new topic to be introduced.
mm. And this is kind of related to another thing. I mean, by the way, I shouldn't keep saying another thing you say in the book. Everything I'm talking about is what you say in the book. But you have often a group or a community in a novel you write will start developing their own language,
Mhm.
right? Their own, and again, this is like Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle as well, but in your books, and you describe in real life how your college friends would often say things if there was food on someone's face, but
Yeah.
and I see this in podcast world too. Like a podcaster will start they'll start using certain words in common, and then their fans start using them in the comments of the podcast, and it is a way to use language to build community.
And it all goes back to Victor Turner and the idea of this experimental limnoid thing that we live in and accepting it and getting to play with it is just so much fun.
I'm really fascinated also by how temporal spacing's used in kind of a narrative. So I'll tell you, it's a little segue, but you'll relate to it. In like 1991 or 90 or 92, I started seeing this one author appear in all these literary journals, and the stories were so amazing. I would just kind of basically copy them and collect them and read everyone over and over again. And then finally his book came out, Jesus' Son by
Oh,
Dennis
okay,
Johnson.
okay.
And I think I've probably read this book in some way or other every week since. And he does this very well where he's got this the character, is named Fuckhead, and it's an interlocking series of short stories all featuring this one kind of drug addict character, and that he's only referred to as Fuckhead. And sometimes he'll be in the middle of this intense scene. Maybe he's driving someone to the hospital who just got shot because he hopes somebody will like him if he does this, which is such a vulnerable and yet intense moment. Someone was shot and is dying, and he's rushing the hospital, and then you get this vulnerable thing. I hope people will like me after this. And then he'll suddenly say, "What else can I say about this moment? The mountains look so far away, they looked untouchable. The sun looked like it was on fire." Some unique way of saying things. But he goes from like this intense plot-driven thing, someone was shot, to this vulnerable submerging of the eye, to then this 30,000 foot, like, what else can I say? Which seems so dissonant with the narrative, but that's the point, really.
Well, and sometimes that kind of giant fade into this grand distance, George Saunders does that quite a bit in
Mm.
short stories when there's kind of you don't want to put too much of a bow on the end of the story. You've demonstrated everything in that kind of Tobias Wolff, dirty realism way. But the camera's got to go somewhere at the end. So the camera goes off into the distance towards the Smoky Mountains and the sunset. Um,
Right,
yeah.
right, because let's say without that, let's say, you know, the next scene if the next scene happens too fast, what is happening biologically? Because I appreciate that you're really looking at what's biologically or neurologically happening. Like, so we know the next scene, if he went too fast into that, where's the disappointment in the body somehow?
Well, another person I really love to read is there's a anthropologist named Shirley Bryce Heath. And she says for fiction to work, it really is dependent upon surprise. So there's always got to be a kind of poetic enjambment or a subversion of the expectation. So have people expecting something and then give them something, either a socially inappropriate reaction, which always occurs as humor because it denies the drama in the moment, or give them something completely different um, that sort of negates the moment and redirects them very quickly.
Right, so, like, a cliche way to do this might be, "This reminds me of something my mother did to me as a kid." That could be a cliche way of doing it where it's just a little too neat uh, to go from the story to a metaphor about your childhood and then back to the story. So Dennis Johnson in that one case is just taking you on this view of the a 400 and he refers to, the glaciers in the ice age carved out these mountains. He's
Right.
going 400,000 years back in time. So it's just this weird interlude while he's hurrying to the hospital with a guy dying in the back of his shitty car.
And in a similar story, but a much more kind of poignant moment is in the story Emergency, where he
Yeah.
is stumbling through this snowy landscape as snow is falling with his friend late at night. And they're both very high. They both work in a hospital emergency room. And he comes over a rise and he sees angels descending from heaven above a military cemetery, all these white crosses, all in rows. And these angels with their beautiful faces breaking through this wintry black sky, and he realizes this is that second coming of Christ, and he's completely in awe, and he's about to die. He's so overwhelmed by this sight, and then the friend he's with is saying, "Dude, check it out. They're showing movies during a snowstorm." And in that moment, we realize it's a drive-in movie theater,
Right.
and it's a screening of Cabaret, and his friend looks at him and says, "What'd you think it was?" And Fuckhead says, "Oh, I thought it was something else."
Yeah.
And all of his awe is uh, so overwhelmed in that moment, so denied in that moment of, "I thought it was something else," that it's heartbreaking, but it's also really funny.
Right. Like, it's almost like, again, it's this way of separating out. There's this rawness to him being high. They just had this experience in this hospital, and uh, 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 it, and again, a hospital is somehow also you think about death, you think about the afterlife, you think about so many things in the context of hospital. You also think about just what's happening right now, the infinite misery and sadness of all the patients in some cases. But so he takes that to the limit, and then you're back down to reality with the movie theater. But then he a few paragraphs later, he says, "Or that might have been another time." So suddenly that whole story is, like, wiped out,
Yeah,
but we're still in the story. Like, it's
yeah.
still him driving around with this guy, but, like, all reality is distorted. It's almost like he at least in those first initial stories in Jesus' Son, reality is just sort of suggestion while he's moving through his story.
And that brings us to the biggest distinction in writing. Strippers and comedians. What do you got on stage? You got strippers. Strippers raise the tension. They raise the tension. They raise the tension. And just at that moment when something bad is going to happen, you bring on a comedian. And comedians cut the tension. They make you laugh and they make you laugh. And they kind of give you that symbolic, huge orgasmic relief of laughing. And then they bring out another stripper. And so it's that constant sort of heightening of the dramatic stakes and then cutting of the drama and then raising the drama to a greater level and then cutting the drama. And that's something wonderful to do in fiction. That is so much fun.
So what do you think he's doing there with the or that might have been another time, and now they're kind of in the spring driving around and instead of the winter, like,
It
what's
allows
happening there?
it allows him to come to the sublime multiple times. It allows for multiple orgasms. It allows him to broach sentimentality for that wonderful length of time, but not for too long, not for Thomas Kincaid, Painter of Light long. And he allows himself to cut it at
Like,
the
very
moments.
fast,
Yeah,
or like, it's just that one line, or that
right.
might be another time. Then he doesn't address it any further, and he goes into the next part of the story.
And then he allows us to ramp up to another sublime moment before he cuts it. And so the idea is to bring the reader up in these kind of graduated ways, but not too quickly and not for too long an extended length of time. And I would argue that he knows on an intuitive level that our brain chemistry will not allow for the sustainment of schmaltz. That schmaltz has got to be cut before it can be achieved on a greater level.
Right, so he cuts it with the, "Oh, we were in a drive-in, it wasn't angels," and then he cuts it again. That may or may not have even have happened, and, because 'cause they're all high, they've got things going on.
And then they're driving around, and don't the rabbits die next?
Yeah, the rabbits die next. I forget which reality that was in now.
It was that same story,
Yeah, it was definitely in the same story. I forget whether it was before the movie theaters or it might have bridged both scenes, actually.
I thought it happened after the morning because,
Yeah, he
yeah,
wakes up.
whatever. Yeah,
They wake up,
yeah,
and he slept on the rabbits.
right. In that same collection, not to give away all the spoilers, is
No, I love that we're talking about this because A, I know that you're the y I read an interview, like, maybe a year ago, you said you've read this, like, 300 times, and I'm, like, thinking, "Okay, I'm not insane that I've also probably read this over 300 times."
um, Dirty Wedding, when he
Yeah,
takes Michelle in for her abortion, and the nurse comes to him in the waiting room, and she says, um, "Michelle is at peace now," or "Michelle is fine now." And suddenly he says, apropos of that, he says, "Is she dead?" And the nurse says, "No. No, why would you say that?" And he says, "I kind of wish she was." And the story is just a freak out moment. The nurse starts calling for security, but that horrible honesty of, "I kind of wish she was,"
right.
just makes you wanna read Dennis Johnson for the rest of your life.
So he does this submerging of the eye there, and it's also cutting the sublime, like in the sense that another part of that story, you have religious people whispering into the ear
Right.
of his girlfriend while she's going towards the facility to have the abortion, and he never it's only in his imagination what is happening in that moment between the there's always this kind of respect somehow for the mysterious that
Mhm.
that the character fuckhead has. And by the way, that I never thought about it before, but character named Fuckhead with Jesus' son, that's a way of cutting the sublime with just the really direct, "This guy's a fuckhead."
And it's a kind of arriving at the profound through the profane. And that's for me, that's always been the goal, is to, maybe have 200 pages of profanity, but to be just to arrive at one page of maybe not profundity, but some moment of grace. Some and that's the end of Jesus' son, the Beverly Holmes story, is arriving at that kind of most extended moment of grace.
Yeah, or I think almost at the end of every one of those stories, there's a little bit of that moment
Mm.
building up to that. Like Jack Hotel, uh, first off, there's that moment again where you have one reality all built up, and he feels like nobody's his friend because nobody told him that Jack Hotel was going to prison. But then we realize he was completely wrong. He realized he was completely wrong. It's a different time again. Jack Hotel was actually the savior and got not going to prison. But the end of that story, you know, I am still alive.
Yeah, every and that's why that book is gonna be around forever and ever. I mentioned Mark McGurl earlier, and McGurl had a theory that every 20 years or so, college courses, writing programs had to redo their syllabuses And the easiest way to teach writing or to get people to read is to give them short story collections. So there is a kind of resurgence or renaissance in short story collections every 20 years because academy programs need them. And so he said, Jesus' Son as a short story collection will always be around because it's so easy to teach. Students love it. Likewise, Junot Diaz's Drown will
Beautiful
always
book.
be around. You know, short story collections are just so easily consumed. And so I love them because the stories are typically very easy to reverse engineer. How did he or she arrive at that? And so you can take them apart in like an engine and figure out what each specific sentence does to get you to that fantastic place. You mentioned Mark Richard.
Yeah.
His story, This Is Us, excellent, about the two little boys who just get the shit beat out of them by their father. And he has got a moment in that story where he's talking about the carney, and he says, the carney's got tattoos on his arms. They're the kind of color of blue that looks black when you see them through a jailhouse window in the middle of winter. And instantly, as a reader, you think, whoa, wait, that is so totally wrong because how would a kid know this? That is such a violation of the point of view of this small child.
Which goes against your advice in the
But
book.
every time you read it after that, you realize that's a flash forward. That's
Ah,
showing you something that happens after the story. That after the story kills the abusive father,
yeah, yeah.
the kid goes and visits the carney in prison. And that's how he knows the simile.
And what's interesting there, and this is related to all of your works, but also what we've been saying about Dennis Johnson. It's almost like they could have said a million things about what this blue looks like, but it seems like all of these people, you as well, it's like you press that extra, you flex that extra muscle. Like, how can I say this in a way that nobody has ever said before? Now
And
he's able to do it to tie into the story in that one situation.
all description should describe the describer more than it describes the described object.
Hmm.
That
That's great.
when you describe something, you should say more about yourself than you do about the thing itself.
So can I ask another Dennis Johnson Jesus unquote?
I hope, yeah.
So there's one story. Uh, now I'm forgetting the name of the story, but he's just had a fight with his girlfriend. He's getting on a bus, and he says, the
The wind whistling through my earring.
no, 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 that's another one, but
Okay.
the images of the city,
Oh, scroll
flashing
through
through,
the
yeah, scrolling through the windows like a slot machine.
yeah, that's
Brilliant.
glorious. Yeah.
And so it seems like that's not okay, I wanna get to your point about what is it saying about him, but first, that one sentence seems really hard to think because I would have just said, "Oh, the city looked like a mess as I passed through it," or whatever, like some descriptive thing. He's not descriptive at all. Like, it's a beautiful way to think of, slot machine implies luck. Maybe it implies bad luck. The kind of people who are at an Atlantic City casino playing a slot machine, they're people down on their luck usually. So I guess that's where he's describing himself, and I never thought of it that way. Like, the slot machine is the worst game. It's the person who's putting a nickel in and just down and out, and that's where he was at that point on the bus.
And it's right, it's the most passive game where you're just gonna accept what happens.
Mm,
Yeah.
man,
Uh,
I'm gonna have to read Jesus' Son again just for the 301st time.
you know, I got to, do a symphony space event a couple years ago, with Billy Crudup, and Crudup
Yeah, played.
presented
Yeah.
portions, and we got to talk about Jesus' Son, and we found out later that Dennis Johnson wasn't there because he was too ill. He died maybe a month after that. Um, but that was a terrific evening just to talk about how that book kind of focused on the phase of life that we all go through, where we're kind of between the family that raised us and the family that will eventually start ourselves. It's that kind of phase where our entire life is fluid and we really have no attachments. Um, and it's kind of a magic time.
Yeah, and also this he wasn't really a part of a community or group, or they were false groups. He
Mhm.
wanted them to like him, but they never really seemed to they gave him that name, that nickname, they never really appreciate him, and it's finally only by the end that the arc goes through where he's still kinda screwed up, but he's accepted. He's found a path to acceptance.
Now that's the final line in the book, and I can't remember what it is. Uh
Well, I have it right here because I knew it was a common interest of ours. Uh, I don't know if I should say it in the thing, but, oh, wait, yeah. Um, yeah, I'll just read the last paragraph. All these weirdos and me getting a little better every day right in the midst of them. I had never known, never even imagined for a heartbeat that there might be a place for people like us. And the us is what just
Yeah.
destroys the reader in a good way.
And that moving to the first person plural is kind of glorious in that last moment.
Yeah, I never thought of that.
Do you want a really similar rush? Have you read Namie Moon's Miles from Nowhere?
No, and are you telling me it's a similar rush to this? Because I've been trying for 20 years to find this type of style.
I envy you so much. It's like you're about to have sex for the first time. Good sex, not like lousy first time sex. Namie Moon's Miles from Nowhere. Amy Hempel called me from Chicago, and she said, "I've just met this writer, Namie Moon. She's a Korean American. She's written this short story collection about a 14-year-old girl living on the streets. It's extraordinary. You've got to read it." And I've since gone out and bought copies and copies. It's one of my favorite books to give away. It is so good. You'll lose 2, 3 hours. You won't put it down.
So by the way, the 1 second after this podcast ends, I'm gonna get that book, but so there's it seems like there's that style, and I'll read her, but let's say Dennis Johnson's like the pinnacle of that one type of style, maybe Raymond Carver fits in there, maybe a little bit. Tobias Wolff, and then there's another style I feel, which is yours, which is very energetic, very descriptive. There's the characters are really intense in some way, and it reminds me of, maybe T.C. Boyle a little bit in some way. Yours tends to be a little more, you use the word transgressional, or, your characters are definitely pushing some limit, and we have to go along for the ride or not. It's our choice, but either way, we get a story. And would you kind of define these 2 styles that way?
Well, um,
Because you describe yourself as minimalist, and I wanted to ask about that too, because there's a different styles of minimalism.
I'm gonna reel it way back to the Mark McGurl book, the program era. And one of the ideas that McGurl kind of floats is that academic writing programs, in order to assign standardized grades, had to, in effect, standardize fiction. So modern literary fiction, not genre fiction, but literary fiction, is now, it has to be one of three different forms. It has to be technomodernism, which he would say it was David Foster Wallace and Thomas Pynchon and Gaddis, or it has to be um, high cultural pluralism, which would be anything from a marginalized standpoint. Cisneros, Sandra Cisneros, Amy Tan, Colson Whitehead.
Would you
Some
put Juno Diaz in that?
was that
Would you put Juno Diaz in that?
exactly?
Yeah.
And the third is dirty realism, which is sometimes called Kmart realism, which is Joyce Carol Oates, Raymond Carver, Dennis Johnson, um, Tobias Wolff.
Bukowski?
Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so if it's not one of those 3, it's really, really hard to get it into the culture because the culture has become kind of clamped down in the same way that academia has been clamped down. Um, but when it does violate those, that's what I'm trying to do, is trying to write something that's not technomodernism, high cultural pluralism, or dirty realism. And that's something that Vonnegut did.
Yeah, you're right, 'cause he sort of takes the skeleton of this pulp science fiction form while writing a serious novel about World War II,
Mhm.
or, the death of the US economy and frontier and whatever. But he structures it in this kind of familiar pulp science fiction 1950s pulp science fiction style.
And in a way too, he kind of mixes up, you could argue, with all 3 of those because Billy Pilgrim in the army is one thing. Billy Pilgrim, present day with his wife, is dirty realism. Billy Pilgrim on the other planet with a porn star is science fiction or high techno modernism. Um, so you could argue that he takes all three of those forms of literary fiction and just intercuts them.
Well, okay, so let me and I don't know if this is too much in the weeds for listeners, but at this point, I don't care because this is the only time I'm gonna get to ask these questions. With Pynchon, Gaddis, and David Foster Wallace, I feel like it's a little different because it's almost like they're and all credit to them, everybody's so much smarter and better than me, but it's almost like their fiction doesn't make sense until you dive in on the structure and see how the actual structure of the novel is in itself telling the story. Like the way the characters are named, the way they describe things, the pacing and the vocabulary of the characters. That's almost just as much the story as the story.
And that's one of the defining characteristics, according to McGurl, is that it's fiction that is really aware that it's fiction. So it happens on a really meta level, mostly.
Yes, for me, that's unreadable. But and I understand in college, everybody was reading either Ulysses or Gravity's Rainbow. I get it. But Slaughterhouse-Five doesn't seem that way to me. It seems like even when it does seem science fiction those parts when he's on wherever Titan or wherever, but or wherever he was, I forget now. No, he was on Tralfamadore,
Right.
and Sirens of Titan was another one. But
Tralfamadore.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. And so it doesn't really it borders on that, but it doesn't really seem like that. Like it's readable.
No, no, it's not a pure sort of
Yeah.
just sort of floating an idea. I'm not saying it's that exactly.
But I guess there's a pluralism in there too, though, because or there's a community because it starts that all that's novel has a weird structure because at the beginning
Right.
it
It's got
starts
the
off
two
almost
war
memoirish.
buddies together. And so it's very dirty realism on the front end.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
in chapter 1, it's him visiting his war buddy, and the
Telling
wife's yelling at
stories.
them like, "You're just gonna write a war story,"
Right.
and then he gets into
So
Billy
it
Pilgrim.
is kind of fake meta in that
Yeah,
way. You could argue that it does fulfill that. Yeah.
but it's also this what you're talking about, mixing of this clever mixing of tenses, narrative points of view. I like this idea that you're bringing up in this book, "Consider This," which is, uh, it's interesting if it fits into a narrative. You could mix anything. You could mix, like, your time periods, you can mix realities like Dennis Johnson does in this weird, like, drug-like way. You could mix genres like, Vonnegut does in Slaughterhouse-Five, as long as you have this your own global sense of what is the story I'm trying to tell. And you bring that up later in the book. There's a quote, I underlined, so now I have to find it, where you ask the questions, where is this? Why is this? I forgot the exact questions you asked. So I hope I can find it. Um, I don't know. You asked these questions I know I'm not gonna find it now.
Now, is it in the troubleshooting section?
No, or maybe anyway, there was these 3 questions you have to ask to move. Why is this story even existing? Who is saying it? Why are they saying it? There are some questions you ask yourself, and I think that's important that uh, the writer, whether or not they're kind of making it up as they go along or they kind of plotted it all out from the beginning, they have to have some sort of sense of the reasons why they're writing this, it seems. Otherwise, Dennis Johnson probably wouldn't have been able to flow in from this drug-like world to another drug-like world so seamlessly without understanding why he was doing it.
And that is something I understood was important for Gordon Lish because Lish taught the man who taught me. And so my teacher said that Lish always said that context was incredibly important in fiction because nowadays people really want to know who's telling the story because they know that the teller of the story and the reason for telling the story shapes the story and might be even more important than the story itself. So in order to make the story seem as real as possible, um, you need to handle the context of the story and the agenda of the story as well as the story itself.
Yeah, so that's why, like, in that Mark Richard example, you said he knows where where this character is going, and so you can then use a variety of devices, as crazy as they could be, to as long as it fits into this context. I think Raymond Carver is a little bit more, um, sort of, I don't wanna say linear, sounds like I'm saying stupid, but almost linear in the sense that he does know his context. So I mentioned Raymond Carver because obviously he's a known student of Gordon Lish, but he it's almost his stories are more linear, even though there's a little sometimes there's a glimpse, like, where he'll say something like in the beginning, "I wish we knew later," "I wish we knew now what we knew later," or something like that. He'll bring up some point about the future, but it still stays pretty linear as opposed to really stretching. But it does seem when you keep context, you can stretch as far as possible without going David Foster Wallace crazy.
Yeah.
And you that do that too. Like, let's just take a short story of yours. Gosh, I'm sorry, I forget the name, but it's the one where guy's about to have sex with a girl and he's injected
Oh,
his
he's
piece.
exposed himself to genital warts so that he can change the size and shape of his penis.
Yeah, not and I got the sense not just genital warts, with, like, everything he could get
Right, right.
from the prostitutes. So he's basically creating this work of art down there, and we're kind of there it's a cliffhanger, right? You're not saying what the end is in the beginning. We know all we know in the beginning is something intimate maybe is about to happen, but there might be a controversy. There's a question about what's going to happen when he pulls his pants down, and so there's this heightening of tension and this cliffhanger, and there's a little bit of going back and forth to the past, and there's a little bit of imagery that we're almost thinking he's almost telling us, the reader, get ready for the worst horror movie you've ever seen or love.
Yeah,
Like, and that happens right up until the very last line,
right.
where, I won't give away the end. But so what's happening there? There's obviously a context, and it's somewhat linear, but there's other things you're doing too, which you're taking the reader beyond their comfort zone in a different way.
And you're also establishing plausibility through gradual sort of heightening of cultural precedent, which
Hmm.
I'm not sure if I invented the term cultural precedent, but it's the idea of taking what people know and using that to bridge to what they don't know so that they will accept it. When they were making the movie Fight Club, somebody on set once asked David Fincher, "Do you think audiences will accept the big twist,
I
the
thought that
big
was you on
reveal?"
set asking him that.
It was somebody else, and I think I was just listening in on it. And Fincher said, "If they believe every wild thing up to this moment, then they will believe the big thing." And my favorite example is, uh, people who were authorities on stained glass windows told me that the artists really focused on the sandals, the plants, the folds of the clothing, the things that are closest to the viewer, because if medieval illiterate people could see the plants from their own lives, could see what they already knew, then as their gaze drifted upward towards the incredible, then they would accept the incredible if it was based on cultural precedent that they already knew.
Also there's I wonder if that's the right analogy, and I respect what you're saying that it is, but there's another thing going on there. There's a cognitive bias in what David Fincher is saying, which is that if you invest the time into watching this movie, it's kind of a what's called sunken cost fallacy. Like, my cost is the time
Mm,
I put into this. So my brain the brain will never let you think you're stupid. People
mm.
tend to think they're smarter than they are. The brain will never let you think you're stupid. So if you've invested this time and you're enjoying the movie so far, your brain and then something happens, what he's really saying is your brain's not going to let you think after you've spent all this time that something irrational just happened. So I don't know if you're familiar with the fine literary art of email copywriting, but if you get an email advertisement, it's not just, "Hey, here's CBD oil, buy this." It might be a 40-page email because they'll filter out the non-customers in the first page or two. But then if someone's gonna read all 40 pages, they're gonna be a buyer because their brain's telling them, "Well, you read all these 40 pages for a reason." Now you probably think this is good. Now you're gonna buy. So because I always wonder why are these emails always 40 pages, and
Hmm,
that's the reason.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Ah, um, but back to, that one story, which was originally called Garden of Ethan, about the, genital warts. It starts with all these very sort of standard body modifications and how, they were accepted and how they were, they kind of, they ramp up. And so each one is introduced, made plausible, accepted, acknowledged until the ultimate reveal of what his body modification is. And so this kind of moving from the cultural precedent of what people know and gradually stepping them up to what they don't know so that they accept it.
Well, and it's also uh right. So it's the body modification, but it's also the standard trope that we all know of those first intimate moments where, oh, who's going to take off their shirt first? Who's going to take off their pants first? And so, which is narrated in a billion stories. So you're borrowing I hate to use the word trope, but you're borrowing from that structure and then kind of so we all identify, okay, is this gonna be what's gonna happen? And we've bought into the structure because we've seen that before and we've experienced that before. But then you take your own twist and turn, your transgression, and uh, uh, I found that fascinating that you're borrowing probably from multiple structures, like the body modification one, the first moments of intimacy one, to take it in, and then you get in the reader's confidence this way, and then it's like totally screwed up after that.
And it works out loud. You know, I hate going on tour with a story that doesn't work out loud. And there's no way to save a book event if the story doesn't work. And it's a story that grabs hold of people and keeps them on board and that they love. Guts was like the penultimate story like that.
Oh, that's the story
Uh,
where I won't give any way plot except for the fact that up to date, 73 people have passed out while you're telling this story.
no, I quit counting years ago at 73. And since then, it's in the hundreds.
Oh my
Um,
god. I can't even imagine. Well, you're telling people to hold their breath a little bit too, which is part of it.
that's the very first thing in this story. This story will last as long as you can hold your breath and then just a little bit longer. So listen as fast as you can, which is kind of a paradox. I mean, how do you listen any faster than what's being told to you? Uh, and I love that crazy little paradox at the beginning. Listen as fast as you can.
Yeah, see, that's interesting too because right, so you're starting with a sentence that's kinda meaningless, and yet it's like you said too.
It starts with the imperative: inhale,
Yeah, yeah.
take in as much breath as you possibly can. This story will last as long as you can hold your breath, and then just a little bit longer. So listen as fast as you can. And then it cuts to description. A friend of mine, when he was 13 years old, he heard all about pegging. At 13 years old, my friend's a little sex maniac. He's always looking for a better way to get off. So, and then it goes into what pegging
Oh, I was
is.
holding my breath right now. I thought you were gonna tell the whole story, but
So
okay.
it starts in the imperative, second person. It hints at the first person, a friend of mine. And by doing so, it submerges the I. It says we're going to talk about somebody else. And then it immediately moves into descriptive third person.
See, okay, so but let me ask you about the listen as fast as you can. How'd you come up with that line? Because you must be thinking to yourself, "This doesn't make any sense." And yet, of course, it fits into the story because if you don't listen as fast as you can, you're gonna pass out. Somehow it makes logical sense, even though it's meaningless.
I wish I knew. If I knew how things like that, came into stories, I would do them constantly.
But it fits into this idea of yours that makes sense, and this idea of that you're quoting from Gordon Lish
Oh,
of there's a context, so you could play within that context as long as you don't go too far that the entire story is meaningless.
well, and also you
And
can,
by the way, this applies to nonfiction, like narrative nonfiction as well.
uh, um, before I lose it, you can have those wonderful moments when a character gets it really wrong because it makes the reader feel smart and it makes
Hmm.
the reader like the character more. Like in Choke, where the stripper, who is naturally a blonde, dyes her hair black after she finds out that blondes have a higher rate of skin cancer. When you read it, you're thinking, "What an idiot," but you're also really liking her.
But that narrative makes sense, right? Because the words themselves, you could imagine someone who's not so smart thinking that or saying that. So, but I guess what you're saying here is the narrative here, just in telling the story, is almost a little haphazard, hence
And it's also delivered in the imperative, and people are less likely to question the imperative. Uh,
or again, like that Dennis Johnson, scene where, again, he's driving fast down to the hospital in the middle of the desert, and then suddenly, what else can I say about this? It's this intensely first person thing, like, you're out of the story, and you switch to this intensely first person thing. It's unreliable in the way that maybe a drug addict would be unreliable.
yeah, yeah, because, you have the authority, it's totally within character to do that.
Yeah, and so but it's interesting the ways you can play with that authority you still have to stay something unique. He couldn't just say, um, "The road was gritty and, cars were passing us and I was afraid they would look." He couldn't it didn't wouldn't make sense to just stick with a straight narrative and pace it out that way.
And he does that wonderful trick of perspective. He says, "It's almost as if we're standing still and the earth is just turning beneath our wheels." And so that is such a wonderful cognitive reframing of the scene that it refreshes the scene in our mind. It's not just a car driving down a road, it's actually a car standing still and the road turning beneath the car.
It's almost an exercise, like each one of these things you suggest, and like let's take this concept of cognitive reframing. Um, it's almost like learning how to dance the tango. There's so many things to remember. Like, you have so many different amazing suggestions in this. Just like there's so many steps. If you're learning a dance for the first time and you're learning the tango or salsa or whatever, you can't remember every foot move and hand move and twirl and whatever. It's almost like a homework assignment. You've got to, okay, try doing a story, true or not, with this cognitive reframing that makes sure it fits the context of the character. Just try that once. Okay, now try, let's go from first person to second person to third person. Now let's go from, description to, uh, uh, imperative to, exclamation.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to keep I can't no one's gonna read this and say, "Okay, now I'm ready to write a novel," and just use all of these techniques. It's kinda like you have to have repetition on each one.
Well, and that's one reason why I put the sort of narrative anecdotes between them to demonstrate it, illustrate it is at the same time that I was talking about it in the abstract.
Well, and what then so you have these chapters, on the tour. So you tell these experiences of yourself on the tour and reading, and you just said that, like, how you're thinking about how you read a story out loud when you're writing these stories, and that connects very much with the techniques you're describing, where it's very much about what is the body going through, which I don't think I've ever thought about. So, for instance, and I never thought about this, you say don't use or try to avoid using to be words like is, was. Instead, use
Or
action
have
words.
or have words. She had red hair. It's the
Right.
worst way of saying it. He had a hammer.
R
Yeah, he had a hammer. That passive has or to be language is death.
Yeah, and you quote, I guess, research, which is that, again, I might have said this before, that the brain now, with is, the brain doesn't do anything. But when you say he swung the armor around his head, the brain thinks it's doing it. So parts of the brain are lighting up, and they've tested this, I guess, or something. And uh, I think in my own stuff, I get used to writing is or was because it feels minimalist. You kind of get to the end of the sentence as quickly as possible. But you're right. But does it ever get cliche if, like, every sentence you're trying to find an action verb to describe what's going on?
It doesn't if you don't overdo it. My students from the beginning, they suddenly turn into movie cameras where everything has to be moved through the scene in every way, and the scenes go on far too long in that very dynamic way, and that does get boring. You've got to, you know, do the motion, you've gotta introduce something different, you've gotta introduce something different, you've gotta revisit things in motion.
Will you ever pace by going back to the is was for a little bit and then going back?
occasionally, and I will allow my students to have, like, one is or has verb on a page, uh,
Do
because
you ever do it structurally? So one character who's more boring than another when you're just
no, it is really just a moment when a moment of sort of we're just flying over, completely unimportant moment. Or maybe a moment where if you had a more specific verb, it would just be too precious. You want it to be kind of a bland moment.
because I sort of feel like and I could be wrong because I haven't tried it, and and now I'm gonna go back through books I love and your books and see the use of it. Uh, it sort of feels like if everything's an action verb, it's gonna feel like, someone's using a thesaurus too much.
That's if you use too much description. If you keep somebody moving, it's if you have a dog or if you see something in motion, your mind, your awareness follows it without thinking, where is it going? Where's that squirrel going? Unless maybe it's a squirrel in your house. But if you see something in motion, you, on some sort of predatory or prey level, you watch it in motion. That's the only time when your eyes do not move in small jerks is when they're following something that is moving. And then your eyes move unconsciously and smoothly. And that is why a thing in motion is used in hypnosis and in therapy, because as your eye is following that moving thing, it disengages your kind of cognitive, intellectual, analytical awareness, and it puts you into the story on a really gut level.
Hmm.
So, as long as you don't overuse it, it's a way of pulling people in against their will.
But again, you say you'll allow people, your students, the occasional is, was, had. Is it occasional or like how do you avoid overusing the
It
action?
it's like using salt in food. It's kinda something you do to taste.
So again, it's
Uh,
like an exercise, like just write a story now. Everywhere you want to use is, which by the way is really hard to do because I tried it this morning. It's really hard to like take out
mhm.
all of your is's.
And that's the whole point, is you're wearing ankle weights so that you get stronger. You're not doing the default thing of using is and has a lot. You become hyper aware of it so that you're less likely, you're more likely to exercise your verbs, use a more specific verb, envision the scene more carefully.
You know, I a couple years ago took ping pong lessons and been playing all my life since I was a little kid. Turns out everything I was doing was wrong, and every habit I had built since I was 6 years old was completely wrong. And so the teacher is a great teacher, one of the best players in the United States, if not the world, and he showed me the right way of doing things, and I thought I was just and I we took lessons for 6 months, and I was just gonna crush everybody. I lost, like, every point after that
Mm.
because I was so out of my comfort zone after 30 years of having bad habits, and so, uh I write every day probably between 1 and 3,000 words a day since 1990. I think this is just gonna crush me for the next 6 months, but we'll see.
This is stuff that has been taught to me or advised to me over 25, 30 years. And so I've gotten it so gradually. And the foremost important people who endorsed Fight Club were Catherine Dunn, who wrote Geek Love,
Yeah.
Tom Jones, um,
By the
uh,
way, the other book I wanna talk about,
Pugilist Arrest, fantastic book.
great collection of short stories, and Cold Sna all his other collections of short stories.
Um, now I've forgotten. So it was Dennis Johnson, Tom Jones, Catherine Dunn, Robert Stone. It was Barry Hannah, not Dennis Johnson. And when I found out that Catherine had died, it meant all four of them had died. And so I wrote this book as a kind of sort of desperate attempt to curate all this advice I'd gotten from so many bright people, including Ira Levin, that I wrote back and forth with for years.
Yeah, I was surprised at that connection, and that makes sense now, knowing his stuff and your stuff, that, okay, we're gonna take this normal situation and we're going to just figure out a way to slice this in an extreme way beyond people's comfort zone. Oh, this girl's not only going to be pregnant, she's going to have the antichrist as a baby.
And we're going to move to this beautiful community where all the women are turned into sex robots.
Yeah.
And because Ira Levin so beautifully illustrates, people think that the solution of the story is the smart thing. No, it's not. It Getting off the Nostromo is not the smart thing. The smart thing is the fact that you've invented this fantastic monster that pops out of people's chests and changes form over the course of the movie. So coming up with a fantastic problem is 99% of a great story. And IR11 knew that
So
it's a fantastic problem, not the great solution.
so let me ask you 2 questions about that, because you quote Ursula Le Guin saying to you, um, when you solve a problem, so she kinda mentioned something similar about.
Never resolve something without raising a greater threat. Yeah.
Right. So even at the end, like, that's why the movie Aliens, at the very end, or Alien, whatever the first one was, there's a bigger alien being born, and so it sets the stage for sequels. But, uh, uh, I thought that was such an interesting thing that, and I don't know if it always applies. Like, again, we just read the last paragraph of Dennis Johnson's book. We see that well, I guess he raises the problem that it wasn't just him being crazy the entire book. We're all crazy.
Mhm.
So that's the bigger problem.
Well, and also at the end of and this is why I always advise my students, don't use death as a resolution because the reader has to go on with their life. And so this acknowledgement at the end that we all have to go back to life and we all have to live tomorrow, we all have to live the moment the book is closed. I think that's one of the beautiful things that he does at the end of that story, is that he gives us sort of a comfort and a completion while acknowledging that there is no comfort and there is no completion.
Yeah, and I thought because it's very cliche to end a book with someone's final moments of life, and, so, but also you mentioned something very interesting in this book, which is have a death before the story starts, like the mother died before the story starts.
Sunset Boulevard, the monkey died. Yeah, because you're showing the transition between one way of being that has been successful for a long period of time and the next way of being which hasn't yet been achieved. So that's why Fight Club starts at the moment just as Tyler is about to be created, because his way of being as a good, obedient kid is starting to fall apart like it does in your late 20s when you realize that if you follow all the rules you've been taught, it's not going to work for you. That's the point where you realize you have to kind of quit being the good kid.
And I think actually that's important for the beginning of almost every story,
Mhm.
that the world you thought existed doesn't exist. That's why he starts Slaughterhouse 5 in such an interesting way, where he's talking about the book in this meta way that he could write a war story like From Here to Eternity, but the wife of his best friend says, "Don't do that. Little kids are dying."
Well,
And
and it's interesting too because it uses the kind of gritty, realistic device as on the front of Citizen Kane, where we get this kind of nonfiction device that seems very, very real. And in doing, it sort of sets the story. It gives an authority to the story by putting it on the front end and giving a context to the story.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it seems like some nonfiction does this by asking a question, like, like I'll think of Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. Let's see, why do hockey players who are born in January do much better than hockey players born in November? But do you mention something in here about starting with a question? Because you start with imperatives in some cases. I'm trying to think now if I'm mixing writing advice. But what's your?
I am not a big fan of rhetorical questions. Uh, I seldom use them, and I kind of dissuade my students from using them because they can be used badly too easily. And forgive me, I have a 7 o'clock dinner appointment, so I need to know what time it is.
Oh, okay. You got to go. Uh, oh my God, I have
I
like a
will
thousand more questions.
I will
When are you coming back
text
to New York?
well, let me text, the dinner people and,
I can maybe sum it up in like 15 more minutes of questions. I know. By the
and
way, I've written 22 books. I really do write 1 to 3,000 words a day, and I've read everything. So this is like the most this and Tim O'Brien coming on the podcast is the reasons I started a podcast. So, which I was about to discuss your notion of lists.
and factor into that, if I may use your bathroom. I've
Yeah,
just
yeah.
drank the water, so
That's so cliche of you.
All right. So I have put in my apologies for being late. All right.
Where do you have to be at?
It's a place called Ribbon at 90 at 72nd.
Oh yeah, it'll take you 5 minutes to get there. I know
Okay.
the place.
Uh, I'll use it on the way out. That's great. Yeah.
And then okay, so what time is it right now? It's 10 till. When do your friends think you're gonna get there? We're gonna plan this so you're gonna get there on time.
Uh, I think our 7:15 was our reservation.
Okay,
So,
you're gonna get there by 7:30,
okay.
and no, if he's gonna go to the bathroom and then take an Uber, but at 7:15 on the dot, when he goes to the bathroom, call him an Uber and to going to Ribbon on 72nd Street.
And I could just walk that. That's not a big
The
deal.
Uber will
Yeah.
be faster. We're gonna get you fast. The Uber will walk you down. It'll be right there. If he calls it while you go to the bathroom. So, okay, another important thing that you get to is borrowing structures that have worked forever to set the spine of a story. So, for instance, you
Mm,
describe lists.
More importantly, borrowing nonfiction structures that
Yeah.
have worked forever, because the nonfiction structure automatically gives authority or gravity, realism to your story, and maybe most importantly, it dictates transitions. Uh, because nonfiction structures have also see also at the end of each chapter or something, it references to other plot points. So you can use these nonfiction structures like the rules in Fight Club. It's a nonfiction structure, and it acts as a transitional device that allows you to sort of jump around, but also make past moments present.
So what's an example of another nonfiction structure? Like, is it explicit in the sense that let's take something like The Legend of Bagger Vance by Stephen Pressfield, which kind of it's this 1920 story of a golf player and his caddy who's kind of his mentor, and very mysterious, and it mimics the structure of beat by beat, every single beat. It mimics the structure of the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, okay.
So, which you could argue is a piece of text that's been focus grouped over 3,000 years successfully. And so he just borrows the structure, knowing that there's something primal so that people will like it if he follows it beat by beat. So is that sort of an example?
Not necessarily because it's a uh, literary form as opposed to a kind of nonfiction factual form. Like I did one book that was based on Walter Winchell's columns and all the devices used in the items of Winchell's
Hmm.
columns. My book Choke is based on the 12 step, fourth step, where you make a complete and relentless inventory of your transgressions. You have to write a history of your addiction. Um,
I see. So for instance, I mean, if this is a standard form, but writing a novel in the form of letters back and forth to
Epistolary, yeah.
yeah, and or writing something in newspaper format or
And again, epistolary isn't necessarily a nonfiction form. It does carry the authority, some authority of nonfiction, but it's so often used as you don't really know if people are telling the truth in letters. So it doesn't carry as much authority as another form might.
so what's some nonfiction forms that maybe you haven't mentioned here, but that would be common structures?
Boy, let me think. I would really have to give that some thought. Yeah.
Like
Because
maybe a I've seen some books, I can't think of any names, but like sort of an unknown doctor providing kind of medical updates on a patient, and you see the story through that. Might be a nonfiction form.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Because it provides a context and an authority, and it provides a structure that has its own distinctive transitional devices.
so like I feel this overlaps with using lists as a narrative form, going from the Ten Commandments up to now. We obviously respond well to lists, and so where's an example there? And
Uh,
you mentioned lists somewhat here, or you like well example with was the things they carried by Tim O'Brien, uh,
right.
and Great Gatsby. I think has a you mentioned a list of guests that
Right, that's written on a train, schedule. My book Adjustment Day has a ton of lists through it, just because right now lists are kind of the moment because of listicles,
yeah,
and, the internet is so full of these very consumable list type of, journalism.
and they work. I mean, if you just measure which articles get the most views,
Yeah.
let's say I'm gonna present something as, "Here's the top 10 quotes from Chuck I learned today," as opposed to, "Here's what I learned from Chuck today," and I did it more just straight narrative form. The first one, the listicle, will get 10 times as many views.
And when it's on the page, it's less intimidating. It's not a big block of copy. The eye is just drawn right to it. I can get through that.
Right, because 'cause you're teaching the reader how to read. You're saying, "Just go from here to here to here." By the way, if you wanna
Yeah,
skip the narrative parts, no problem, just go to the list.
yeah, yeah. I'll leave it at that.
Now, you also talk about, and I forget the exact quotes, and I'm not gonna be able to find uh, where I folded over, but and the way I picture it in my head is, even though this is not how you said it, it's good to sometimes ground characters, like, they need to know what they're doing somehow, and I'm thinking in specific. I'm trying to think of the exact words you use, but once I make the reference to an author, you'll know. So, Tom Jones, when his character is a doctor in one of the stories, I think in Cold Snap, it's like you know everything. You get the feeling that the author knows everything about what it's like to be a doctor, and even the arrogance and the car, and then he just how to do heart surgery, and you get this sense this is a really competent, maybe even arrogant person, but you trust him because he sounds exactly like how you would expect a doctor to sound, right down to the surgical tools and some technical stuff, just like Tim O'Brien and the things they carry. You know, this guy knows how a gun works, how war happens, what happens. So there's some sort of authority you can establish with description. And I forget exactly what you
And it's
mentioned
really
here.
about really getting inside the character so that as the character describes the world, the character is describing themselves more effectively. And
Hmm.
so that you're seeing the entire world through the character, and in doing so, you're really seeing the character. Uh, and that's the greatest, funnest authority because once you're inside the character, you don't worry about how you describe the world because you know exactly how that character would describe the world, what they would see when they walked in a room, what they would identify, what they would engage with.
Right. And it seems like one way to do that is to describe really well their job. Like if someone just shelves at Walmart, there's got to be nuances to it that I don't know that someone who actually does it would know. And by doing that, by showing the difference between that person and that character and me, I now trust with his great description of what he does. What it's sort of grounding him in what he does, showing how competent.
You're showing his body of knowledge.
Yeah.
What does that person know better than maybe anybody else in the world? And it's also really flattering to the character because we're really drawn to those characters that not just know something, but can articulate it and communicate it. And that's really appealing. I think that's why great teachers are so appealing, is that they know what they're talking about and they can tell us what they're talking about. Yeah. I don't mean to diss masterclass, but a lot of my friends who have subscriptions or bought masterclass, they say that some fantastically brilliant people who do great work are really, really lousy at breaking it down and teaching it. Um, but they say that Neil Gaiman is great, that he can talk about what he does and he can teach you what he does really, really well.
Hmm. And in terms of using so that technique you use to establish the reliability and the uniqueness, the somewhat reliability and the uniqueness of this character, at least
And
the competence.
the authority too.
Right. So the authority, not necessarily the reliability, because he might be unreliable in emotional ways or other ways, and that sort of drives the plot forward as him being competent in one way and unreliable in others, as is the case in some Tom Jones characters. But how would you say overall that moves the story forward, the plot forward?
And to some extent, it's their unreliability that moves it forward, like in Fight Club. Here's a character who is violating the violating the social contract by allowing dying people to think that he is also dying. And so that they show him nurturing and support and love, and he does not have to reciprocate it because by the time they figure out that he's not dying, they're dead.
Hmm.
So he's basically just processing through these people and getting his emotional needs met in this very covert way.
And descriptive, like you're feeling what he's feeling because he's competent at doing. this.
and he's very clever, and we can admire that there's an authority that comes with that cleverness, but we also know that the moment he gets found out, everything is gonna be destroyed.
It's almost like also like a Silence of the Lambs thing where this person is he's like a psychopath and he's extremely competent and detailed about killing people. And it's kind of a classic horror slash mystery slash thriller, but you kind of have to establish, I guess, for the plot that this person who's obviously screwed up and a psychopath knows what he's doing at least with killing people.
But the trick is to have them do a despicable thing, but for a noble motive.
Hmm.
And so, like in my book, Choke, where a character pretends to publicly choke to death so that people will come and give him the Heimlich maneuver and they can symbolically bring him back to life and therefore become kind of adopt him.
Right, and so he becomes an expert at how to not only choke realistically, so they feel like they have this is, like, not a serious thing, they have to save him, but also kind of the emotional steps afterwards. He's an expert at those communications to make them wanna continue to support him.
Right. And so,
So he's like an expert, and you trust that authority there.
because he does this horrible thing, but he does it cleverly and he does it for a kind of noble reason that you can identify with. That it's an emotional reason. It's not just there's never really a reason for why Hannibal Lecter kills, which is kind of, the flaw of Hannibal Lecter. He's just a psychopath. He just kills. But if you can give them an empathetic reason for what they do, the evil thing that they do, but at the same time, you build in the self-destruct of it because the moment people figure out everyone figures out that everyone's been fooled into thinking they saved Victor's life, that's the moment when Victor's life is destroyed, is when their scam is revealed. Um,
Well, you present a bigger problem.
exactly. And that's the third of the book that you don't know what's going to happen. And that's the joy of writing.
Mm. And then, I guess a final question, which I don't know really if you address here, but I'm just curious. I mean, first off, I just want to say for the final question, this book really, there are so many little sub chapters and techniques and things that blew my mind about writing and reading and your story. And I like how you mix your story with all the techniques. Every uh, every technique here is worth a homework assignment of trying to write using that technique, and it's uh, amazing. Like every chapter, again, f- I'm so glad you came to the podcast and let me ask you these questions. And this book has blown me away. I'm sure I'm going to read it a billion times. But I don't know if you addressed this in the book, but so I'll ask. What do you think about cliffhangers, particularly while you're writing a book? Do you think, okay, I need a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter, at the end of every paragraph? How do I keep the reader moving forward? You talk about there's a little moving the reader forward, but what about in the context of cliffhangers?
You always want to introduce an unresolved thing that heightens attention. Um, and I think most effectively that's done through gesture or a physical sort of reveal. It's seldom done with a blackout line, a line of dialogue. Um, the movie Cabaret, I watch Cabaret over and over just because almost every scene resolves with a gesture. There,
What do you mean? Like, what's an example?
um, boy, Divine Decadence. You could watch that movie with the sound off, and you would see that gesture morph from the first moment she meets David York at the door to the very end of the movie, where she puts her hand up on the train platform and we see her from behind, and she does the exact same gesture. And this time it means, goodbye, I'm going to die. I choose to die. And at the beginning, it's a lighthearted, wonderful, goofy gesture. And every time she meets a new person, we see her do it again. We see her do it again at the dinner party scene. And then at the end, she does it again before it's implied that she's to be destroyed.
And so, do you feel those gestures or those kind of mini cliffhangers should happen at the end of a chapter to keep people going into the next chapter? We live in this attention glutted economy. You have to keep pushing people.
Well, no, and it's just your obligation as a writer is to keep heightening tension, keep people engaged, give them something for their time. Books take such an enormous amount of time. I don't care what books cost. They take a big chunk of your life. They
Yeah.
cost so much of your life to consume that the obligation is they should offer a fantastic continual reward as you consume them.
And and then we'll wrap, but in the macro sense, you have a lot of stuff about kind of broadening the definition of, you know, Chekhov's quote, if there's a gun introduced in the first scene, it's gotta be fired in the final scene. And you broaden that, like, you use gun as a metaphor, something has to be put somewhere in the first scene that's gonna be metaphorically fired in the last scene, but I guess you can do this in smaller ways throughout the whole book with these gestures, for instance,
Right.
and so on.
And so you have all these small ways of completing things that give the readers so that those intermittent uh, rewards, the payoffs. Something is revealed, but a greater thing is put at stake.
Well, Chuck Palahniuk, consider this. The book is called Consider This: Moments in My Writing Life After Which Everything Was Different. Uh, That's a good subtitle. I had to think about it for a second. And great. I encourage anybody who writes at all, and I'm gonna to read this book. It's fantastic, and I'm so glad, by the way, that right up until the list of the books to read, fiction and nonfiction. I'm so glad we had so much overlap on the fiction we like, and
We didn't get to talk about Tom Jones very much, or
I
Mark Richard. Ah, another fantastic, or Amy Hempel.
Amy Hempel. Oh, I was gonna mention
Ah,
Amy Hempel too because I feel she has a similar energy in her writing that
mhm.
you have. Just that kind of like it's not quite breathless, which I don't quite like, but just energy, like this playfulness where she's not afraid.
And she uses exclamation marks, which have completely gone out of style. Nobody uses exclamation marks in fiction, and they're just they're so bright now. They just jump off the page
And
because
I
we're
think it
in.
gives her a play. I think that adds to the
Yeah,
playfulness, like
yeah.
because it adds like, why is that happening? Why is she excited? I should be excited. And and again, there's a couple of fiction writers, but you do this too. You have this playfulness that you can go in any direction with the text, and I feel that's similar to Amy's. With Tom Jones, I feel it's that ultimate, just sheer authority of the main character of each story. Somehow or other, he establishes this is our boxer, this is our doctor, this is a jerk, and then he just the power of that drives through the story in all of his stories.
And the Mark Richard story Strays.
Well,
That
I really like his memoir too because he's got such a vulnerability to him, and Ice at the Bottom of the World, and his stories,
yeah.
and was the House of forget his memoirs in the second person so beautiful,
Mm.
and it's almost like in the second person because he's so vulnerable, he can't
That's
refer to
interesting
himself as an I.
because Isherwood's memoir was in the third person, Christopher and His Kind,
Hmm.
and if I didn't care for it because I thought it was kind of a form of hiding. But now that I'm an older person, I should go back and reread it because it might actually be more honest in the third person.
Yeah, because it removes. y- I haven't read that, so I don't know. But I feel like with Mark Richard's second person, it removes the ego a little bit, takes you a little
Yeah,
further from the I,
yeah.
and also makes you relate to something that you might not have experienced, which is, his deformities as a kid and so on. He's this beautiful writer. And you also mentioned, I've heard you mention somewhere, I don't think you mentioned it in the book, but Cheryl Strayed's, so and she's a other Portland resident, but I love Wild, but I love her nonfiction advice, Tiny Beautiful Things.
Yeah, Cheryl was in our workshop for years while she was writing Wild. She wrote it in our workshop.
Hmm.
So, yeah, good for Cheryl.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful book. And then, I don't know. I'm like, all right, one second, because we're gonna go to
Ah,
the back of your book for a quick second, and then we're gonna get you out of here. Uh, uh, where's the? All right, I can't get to it easily. So, uh,
are you looking for the
the
reading
fiction,
list?
yeah, the fiction reading list.
Wow.
Uh, like everything on
Oh,
there was.
Nora Ephron. You
Oh yeah,
know,
Nora Ephron. By the way, who lived in this building?
yeah, she wrote an essay about this building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, Yeah, Airships by Barry Hannah, Cathedral by Raymond Carver,
Yeah.
classic. I'm surprised you didn't mention, Haruki Murakami in here because he translated Carver into Japan before he started writing his own
Did
novels,
not.
and he has kind of that when he's not in his short stories, at least, has a little bit of a Carver feel. But also, you know who you reminded me of, who's got that similar kind of energy as an Amy Hempel, was Slaves of New York by Tama Janowitz.
I mentioned that elsewhere in the book, but I should have mentioned that because those linked short stories,
Yeah,
it's another wonderful way of telling a longer story in very sort of dissimilar, seemingly dissimilar viewpoints.
yeah.
But that's a wonderful book.
And, of course, The Night in Question by Tobias Wolff, The Pugils at Rest we just spoke about. Gotta read Naomi Munn, never read that. Uh,
Moon, name me Moon.
Moon. Uh, yeah, and then also Irvine Welsh, who has that kinda energy,
Yeah,
that sort of electricity
yeah.
in everything, and that sort of drives everything forward, like, what are these characters gonna do next? But
And
alright.
he transcends dirty realism. He adds
Yes.
a kind of Kafka fantasy to dirty realism.
What do you think of, like, James Frey's novels?
I haven't read them. I haven't read his novels. I thought he just had the one.
Yeah, 'cause no, he has a whole bunch in there. I think you would like, the first one, A Million Little Pieces, which had the scandal around it,
Right.
but it really is like a beautiful piece of fiction. Like, forget the scandal. E Again, the language matches the story. So at first, there's this alcoholic drug addict. The language is a little bit frenetic, and I like it when structurally things change as the character changes and evolves, kinda like in Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son.
I'll give it a try.
Well, thank you, Chuck Palahniuk. Consider this. I hope you come back to New York and come on the podcast again. You could knock on the door at 3 in the morning and I will wake up and do a podcast with you. And the other thing in 530 guests, I've never asked any guests to do is I want you to autograph this book. So,
Ouch. Ouch, ouch. I'll do it with a good pen.
and I'm asking anybody
You do it in the lights.
to write
Yeah.
this book, even over Fight Club, which would be the cliche thing for you to autograph. I want you to autograph this one. Whoa, look at these notes. Yeah, just everything's folded over. I can shut down the podcast now.
Retired.
All right. There you are.
All right, man. Thanks so much.